And I'm not suggesting we go back to a rehabilitation model. I'm suggesting that we actually let convicts take some of the lead role. When I went to the Congress that Luke established in Amsterdam in 1985, I was really struck by the absence of anybody from the bottom. And it struck me as like having a women's liberation movement without women. So how could you possibly have a penal abolition movement without prisoners?
When Justice Action agreed to host ICOPA 11 in Australia, we thought Tasmania would be the ideal setting for a penal abolition conference because of its history as the notorious penal colony of Van Diemen's Land. As well, we would be able to combine such sessions with an ANZOC conference being held in Hobart and bring attention to present-day conditions at Hobart's Risdon Prison. We thought this would be an excellent base for ICOPA to develop its strategies for the future.
My work in prison started in the late 1970s and focused specifically on deaths in custody, predominantly in the UK. One of the proudest things that I can tell you about myself is that I'm a founder member of Inquest, the United Families for Justice, which is the one organisation in the UK that fights for justice in terms of custody deaths. I'm not going to say very much about Guantanamo because of what we've just heard from Terry. But one thing I do want to say is that at the height of the atrocities in Afghanistan, and just as the atrocities were being translated into unlawful detention and the breach of the Geneva Conventions, our foreign minister was Peter Hain, the ex-anti-apartheid activist, the ex-civil libertarian, and I put an emphasis on ex. He's also now the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And when an inquiry was called for, particularly after the deaths of 900 prisoners who were held just north of Kunduz in sealed containers, like the containers that we see at the shipyards, which was one of the great atrocities of the war, he said, "We do not see a need for an inquiry. Nasty things happen in war." And I think that one of the things that continues to be with me in terms of the whole handling of both wars, both illegal wars, has been the way in which the solitary confinement, the beatings, the mock executions, the rape with instruments have been justified as if the people themselves deserve it, that they bring it on themselves.
I want to pick up from where Bob left off, because Bob emphasizes the bringing in of voices and the turning to prisons and prisoners to understand the criminal justice system. And when I say criminal justice system, I am talking about a criminal type of justice system. So it's a criminal justice system, just so you know as I go through. And I want to add to that, because I believe that when we're talking about prisoners, that we're actually talking about people of color. And more specifically, in the context of America and Africa, we're talking about people of African descent or Africans. My time in Nigeria showed me that the criminal justice system exists on African soil, and that it was brought there by European colonialists, and that the same system which legalized slavery and colonialism now so-called governs the actions of people in so-called civil society in Nigeria, Ghana, the Gambia. My experiences. And I could talk about that, and I will tomorrow, but today I actually want to focus more specifically on America, because I'm living in the United States, and it does feel like the belly of the beast. And I have learned a lot while I've been there, and the thing that I've learned most about is that in order to understand prisons and to understand abolitionism, we must see the larger picture of population control. And the work coming out of the people of color communities and the people of color scholars in America and the United States have really inspired me to step and look back and see the functionality of prisons, as Foucault would say.
I agree very much with Vivian that when we look at our movement, that in that movement we have to bring elements of very different civilizations. And for me, anyway, one of the civilizations which is so important for me, my own growing into abolitionism was indeed to learn about the civilization of what we call the older people, and how those civilizations of those older people, quite contrary to what many people had been thinking, and which I have been raised also in, that there was progress and that we were better and that we had a deeper civilization. I learned that many of them had, according to my standards of civilization, a deeper civilization.
Come up with a corrupt police brief, went to the coroner's court, who willingly or unwillingly accepted that corrupt brief, also narrowed the proceedings, so justice was not allowed to be done. Witnesses were barred, evidence was barred. I and others attempted to get some sort of sanity into that court. We were more or less barred from the court. We were thrown out. We were not allowed to interrupt the court. And of course the police were exonerated and walked out smugly smiling, as is their wont whenever they get away with this. Now another particular recommendation was that arrest would be as a matter of last resort. The police don't even know that's there. The other one for the courts is incarceration, will be as a matter of last resort.
When the ALP conference debated setting up the deaths in custody, and it was, I have to say, conceived in sin, in that basically it was, they abolished the ALP's policy of national land rights, and the payoff was that they would set up this inquiry. And of course, one of the recommendations of the inquiry is that if Aboriginal people have land rights, then they're less likely to form such large percentage of the prison population. So it was always a compromise.
When I was Children's Commissioner in Tasmania from 2000 for 3.5 years, I came to realise that they were actually putting children and young people into adult prisons and adult remand centres. And I objected to that strongly and recommended to the government they shouldn't do that. And I became a member of Prison Reform Alliance of Tasmania. I said I'll stay in here till they make a commitment not to put kids in adult prisons. And the second thing was to try and get kids away from juvenile justice facilities and intervene early to do a human rights approach for helping children and families early so they don't go into the juvenile or prison system. In other words, address the issues facing each child, each family, that lead them to the pathways that lead them to prison and juvenile justice.
So one thing you can notice is the high remand population in the Nigerian prison. Somebody that has been in prison for 10 years, the person has no scare, the person, if the person just come out of the prison like that without any skill, no reformation, reintegration will be a problem. And moreover, the government doesn't have a plan for them on where they will stay when they leave the prison.
I'm sure in all jurisdictions, all the places we're from, that we can find and identify such institutions. But certainly, and I don't implicate anybody here, obviously, not the person I'm talking to, but the Tasmanian and Australian governments should be ashamed. The physical plant is old and filthy. The room they took us into is patched on the wall. I mean, if that's the best they can offer visitors, what indeed does it look like, I thought, back in the bowels of the place? We met with 2 Aboriginal prisoners. We had been told before that there were 14 in the institution. As it turns out, indeed, there are 80. The 2 prisoners were accompanied by a what I would call a social development officer, who was also of Aboriginal descent and who I thought was quite open with us, and certainly the prisoners felt free to talk.
In the new prison outside, a new women's max unit. They've tailored the cells, built the cells. They said based on Queensland, but like Bob said, that that comes from the US. 4 cells under camera that you can see absolutely everything from the showers to the toilet and everything. They were suggesting no, the cameras are just that way, but you can see the cell. And then there's domes on the roof in every cell that when you look in, you can actually see they're mirrored domes anyway. So women will be under constant surveillance no matter what they're doing in their cells.
I was a boy, 4-year-old, ended up in a boys' home, stayed there till I was 15 years old, ended up in prison. At 15 and a half, I was in Risdon Prison and stayed at Risdon Prison and other institutions all over Australia for about 30 years. Life is a lot different than we know it out here about jail. They've turned the yards now into a little dog yards for people to walk in. They're handcuffed, they're belted, they've even got shackles on them. They've gone back to Port Arthur days.
Over the last couple of days, I have to say I've been very inspired by words of many people as in what ICOPA's about, what we stand for, and I think it's a wonderful thing. But the questions that stay in my mind most of all is, okay, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to do it? What prison done for me, instead of turning me into someone productive, they turned me into a person that could pretty much kill you in an instant. I haven't had this anger that I feel now. I never grew with this. They created it. And I think the prison system as a whole really should look at, all right, you can't fix crime, but you can certainly fix the criminal. I want to talk about that and what it's done to me, and especially the siege, because the siege was an important part in Tasmania's prison history. We had a collective group of men that decided to occupy reception. What did they do it for? They didn't do it for wine, women or song. They didn't do it for lesser sentences, or there wasn't cries of innocence. This was all about, those were all about human rights issues.
Our situation, as far as Tasmania is concerned, is that we have a government that's not the least bit interested in dialogue. All the prison activists have been locked out of the jail. We've been told that we will be banned until further notice. Today we actually tried to go out to the prisoners as a group of ICOPA delegates, but none of us were allowed in. We spend an awful lot of time, I guess, dealing with complaints from the prison system, both from families and prisoners. And we recently, or last year, published quite a substantial report on those complaints. And although we disseminated it fairly widely around Australia and overseas, the Attorney General has not taken an ounce of notice of that, and in fact this week said that most of our complaints, the vast majority of the complaints that we made in that report were unsubstantiated and wrong.
People were running around, not knowing what happened, and at the top of Spring Hill Avenue where I lived, my uncle was looking for his children, and he was 42 years of age. He was in his bare chest, no pair of bedroom slippers, and a pair of trousers, and there was mayhem. British Army were ripping houses up, and he was running around looking for his sons, and he was shot dead. He was shot, he didn't die right away. Mrs. Connolly was shot dead, Martin Butler was shot dead, Joe Carr was shot dead. The priest, Father Hugh Mullen, ran out to try and assist the women who were dying, and he was shot dead. And we could not get over to them. We had to watch them lying there all night. So after I saw that, no one was charged with those murders. And it was a night of mayhem, and it was right across the 6 counties of Ireland that this internment was going on. And in the middle of all that, these people who were murdered, basically, were not mentioned in the papers. No one was ever charged for the murders. And when I saw that, that was a turning point for me. And I joined the Irish Republican Army, and I engaged in war with the British forces and with the state forces, which were the RUC.
Aboriginal voices are not very much heard, except when people like me get behind the microphone, then you can't shut us up. But I'd also like to say thank you to the people I've met, and I am going to leave this ICOPA conference with a lot of good memories. It's been one of the best conferences that I've been to.